Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Future of XYZ. This week, we are speaking about the future of queerness. With me is my dear friend, Kim Tai. Kim, thank you so much for joining us on Future of XYZ.
Of course. Thank you for having me, Lisa. I'm so honored to be here.
Well, it's our honor to have you. Kim's background is pretty impressive. She is an Emmy Award-winning producer. She's a published author and former journalist with a master's in journalism from Columbia University. She is a mindfulness teacher, the founder of Ganesh Space, which we can talk a little bit more about, and its focus on inclusion and changing norms. And she's more and more, I would say, a very activist voice in the LGBTQ plus community. So again, Kim, thank you, and welcome to Pride Month, the end of Pride Month. I think Sunday is Pride Parade, at least in New York City and probably elsewhere around the world.
Yes, happy Pride, happy Pride.
So I think the first question, if we're talking about the future of queerness, let's define queerness first.
Yeah, absolutely. I think in order to talk about the future, we have to talk about where it started too, right? And the history behind it. I think queerness, first, historically, it's really important to know it started off as a derogatory term, right? Like we think about that sort of slang of like queer as a $3 bill, right? Is it $3 or $2 bill? It's not two.
It's a three. It's a
three, right?
Yeah.
And so, it's really interesting in the last sort of like 5 years, I would say 5-7 years, we really saw this sort of reclamation of the word queer from the LGBTQIA plus community. And I think a lot of that was like, hey, we really want to make this language ours and we really want to own it, right? And so one of the things I love about the word and the concepts and the term of queer is the fact that it's sort of naturally ambiguous, right? There's this sort of idea and definition of it being inherently fluid and inherently not having a shape or form, right? And I very much identified with this term sexually, not from my gender identity, but early on, because I was like, well, I guess I could call myself bi, I don't know, but it was more along the lines of like, I was much more comfortable just being in this sort of gray and non-binary sort of space when it came to my sexuality. And so I think, when I think of queerness and the way that I define it, it's being okay with that gray space, right? And so, and I think, that sort of philosophy and ideology can be applied a lot to life too, whether or not you identify in the community or not.
I like that. I mean, ultimately, as you said, it was a derogatory term where queer is just anything different than the norm, right? So cisgender is identifying with, your born gender or sexual identity. And then, of course, you have straight people, of which I am both of those things, in full disclosure, and so this is topics that even I think this talks to a little bit the state of things, as the progress happens, right? It is moving in some ways so quickly, right? The acceptance, especially around transgender, and some of these added, acronym letters to the definition, it's hard. It's sometimes hard to keep up and to understand. So can we also just talk about kind of what's been happening in terms of the identities and what makes queerness, this kind of all-encompassing umbrella at this point?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that's it. If you actually look at the pride flag, it's been redesigned a couple of different times now, right? Like it's become more and more inclusive in the last couple of years. So like we know the traditional sort of rainbow colors, right? And I think the origin story of that was that like I think the original designer said he wanted it to be something positive and bright, but also still very natural. And that's where the idea of a rainbow symbol came for the community. But as time kind of moved on, and if you look historically too, that unfortunately, even within the community, people of color were marginalized, right, and kind of pushed aside with their needs, and then specifically the trans community. And so there's been a lot of sort of pushing and huge strides made within and outside of the community to make sure that queer people of color, specifically queer Black people, and Black trans people, have more of a voice in the fight, right? Because often they've been overlooked. And I think, you know, if you look at the state of things now, like, yes, that there's been progress and there's definitely been more acceptance. You know, a family friend, an older woman, like her granddaughter came out as non-binary from a gender perspective, right? And she was just telling me, the grandmother was like, you know, it's hard for me to even just switch like from she to they, and like, how do I even do that in my brain, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's valid, but I so appreciated her effort to even want to do that, right? And one of the things I'll say too is this seems to be a point of conversation as more people are feeling comfortable coming out as non-binary from a gender perspective, is that even that one pronoun, right, of it really validates their experience and identity, right? And misgendering someone really has such harmful impacts. So something that might be just like an inconvenient grammatical thing for us is actually huge point of validation for someone else, you know.
And it makes so much sense because, of course, similar to race or religion, you know, and maybe even more so, you know, how you are perceived and how I understand yourself. When those things are mismatched, you kind of lose a place in the world to some degree. And when it's matching and you feel seen, you find a place in the world in a profound way. I think the growth of the community, I mean, we can go back to 69 and the Stonewall riots, you know, in New York City's Greenwich Village, as really the beginning of the fight for gay rights, let's call it, at that time.
Sure.
And the machinations since then, I mean, the role in the United States of the Supreme Court, the role of certain legendary leaders, all of this has kind of continued to go on. And I believe that Pride Month started was officially designated Gay and Lesbian Pride Month by Clinton in '99. And of course, it's taken on further and further again, going forward with the times. What do you see as kind of the biggest, most exciting thing that's happening in 2021 and coming out of COVID especially? And what is, where are things heading?
Yeah, I mean, exciting. I mean, I think for me, what's really exciting is that we're actually going to be able to celebrate Pride this year, right? I think like we had to shut down last summer, and so traditional sort of Pride March, right, wasn't accessible. And I think that was really debilitating to a lot of the community to not be able to come together, right? It's such a part of the culture and such a part of the resistance. And I have to say too, I think one of the pieces coming out of the pandemic is that, and this has been happening for years now, is that corporations have really hijacked Pride, right, and made their logo a rainbow flag, and like that's been enough. And I think Representative Jayapal recently was like just literally like broke down every single company that has put out a rainbow flag, but hasn't actually done anything to help all the anti-trans bills that are on the floor right now, right? So I mention all that to say that I think the community coming out of the pandemic, and I think at large, is becoming a lot more aware of that sort of capitalizing off of a movement, and that I think that people are getting more towards the heart of what it really started as, to your point at Stonewall. So
I think that's pretty amazing. And you said something really beautiful, and it'll probably come up in the quote card, but that the parade is such a part of the culture as well as of the resistance.
Yeah.
And having been to Pride in many cities and celebrating, alongside, I think there is something profoundly cultural
Mhm.
about the togetherness. And of course, last year also, I mean, let's not forget, it was the middle of Black Lives Matter and all the police activity and defund the police and everything else. So Pride had a double whammy on it, COVID plus a social reckoning. It's interesting though, because that social reckoning, of course, has multiple meanings. And I'd love to get into some of the work that you're doing at Ganesh Space, because in fact they are very intricately, as a queer Asian, yourself, I think that is a very interesting kind of intersection of queerness and race and identity overall. So tell us all about Ganesh Space a little bit and the work that you're aiming to achieve.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, for us, so we're, a community organization that really explores the intersection of mindfulness and social justice, right? And so we really look at creating these spaces to dismantle internalized oppression, right? And so I think one of the things about that is questioning the constructs that we live in and the human experience as defined by our current society, right? Which all sounds really heady, but we all do it through yoga mats and meditation cushions. But I think so much of the experiences that we live in day to day, we're questioned, our worthiness is questioned because of identity matter, labels, right? Whether it's sexuality or gender or a race or through our body. And so we really take this space and say, hey, how much of that narrative has been imposed on us, and how much of that can we flip the script, right? And actually feel empowered as we're moving out of these mindfulness practices and be able to actually take that energy and then also do good in the world, right?
Mm-hmm.
So to your point, last year we really felt like we had to do something with both the resurgence of Black Lives Matters and with Pride Month, and we did this huge Pride Festival, Pride and Purpose, where we only had Pride presenters and teachers and speakers, and we were able to raise $7,000 to the Audre Lorde Project for their Black trans, programs, right? Because it was really important for us to be able to help support the community in that way. So I think that's one of the things that I hope anyone listening to this will take out of this is hey, there's always a way that you can actually show up as an ally, no matter how you identify, and at whatever intersections you live in. And something as simple as even putting your pronouns in your name, right? I think can really help people feel more seen in a very gentle and subtle way if you're not one to go march on the streets.
Yeah, I mean, I remember last year, actually, the Black Trans Lives Matter parade right downstairs from me with the all whites and fabulous. And it went on for blocks. It was so impressive. And it was, for me, I think, an eye opener, as for many, that this is such a marginalized community who finally was able to feel proud and seen at such a large scale. It's interesting because, of course, we've had a change of administration since then as well. And, you're talking about the anti-trans bills that are going through Congress at so many levels and in state legislatures and everything else. Of course, America is still, I mean, in some ways we're reasonably progressive, and in many ways we are extremely not by the world standard. What is happening right now politically, if you're willing to discuss it, that you as an activist have your eyes on, that you think is really potentially positive or potentially really detrimental to the queer community?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I'll say is that I think, when we were under the Trump administration, anyone who, aligned with progressive politics, was on very, very high alert, right? We were very much oh my God, we have to watch every single second. We're going to check the news every chance that we get. What is this guy doing? Like, injecting disinfectant into our arm, all the things, right? And I think one of the things that has become really dangerous under the Biden administration is that, there's a lot of legislation that's still being pushed through by conservative lawmakers that just aren't getting as much press, right? Or attention. Like if you actually look at this last legislative session, 117 bills were introduced that were anti-trans. That's the most that has been introduced in the last 15 years. And most people don't know about that.
And where is that coming from, Kim? Like, where are those originating?
I mean, the South, but I think that they're originating in the sense that these conservative lawmakers are hoping to quietly push through these bills and not really gain that much attention, right? It's happening with voting rights and we're like, dawning on a new sort of Jim Crow era down South as well. And so I think, you always see this sort of big backlash that happens with extreme sort of progressive politics and also extreme conservative politics. And just because the head of the beast is no longer steering the ship, it doesn't mean that people are still not pushing through this legislation, and so and I think that the other piece that's at least heartbreaking for me is that most of these bills are actually going to affect transgender youth the most, right? And these, we're talking about 17-year-old high school kids who are just trying to figure out life,
Figure out life. Well, I thought it was, I actually, my first kind of awareness of the transgender challenge, if you will, as a human being is when Trump basically overturned the Obama era serve in the military.
Totally.
And then the whiplash, of course, and it's all by executive order, executive writ, and now having them back in, and I say and of course in prisons and now COVID care and all the rest of it. I mean, it is so complex, and these are human lives that are fragile to begin with for all of us, much less when, again, we go back to who you feel you are, you're not being seen, not being identified. The fragility is so rough. And then you add to it minority, communities where it's not understood and people are isolated and ostracized and don't necessarily have the familial or community support. And you think that there are 117 bills, I think is the number you gave. And it breaks your heart because you realize, to your point, this is a generation of people. There's a generation that's already been dealing with this, but at least in my experience and with my friends' kids, there's a generation that is coming up that these normatives of male, female are no longer enough. The binary doesn't work. And I'm not sure if you have an opinion on why that is in the future of queerness, because it seems that a gender fluid future, not just sexual orientation, but gender is actually where we're going a bit.
Yeah, thank goodness, right? It excites me anyways. I mean, I think we're going towards that because we can't live in a black and white world anymore, right? That's sort of the that's the reality of it. And even if let's not talk globally for a second, but just talk personally, right? But when you're going through your day-to-day life and things have to be rigidly this or rigidly that, I think we can all say that we've either done that ourselves or experienced coworkers or bosses where that's not very a productive way to live, right? Or to work. And so and show up in the world. And so I think this idea of expanding our sort of horizons and consciousness and the way that we look at things is actually going to create more flexibility, is going to create more humanity, right? And seeing each other. And I think the reason why it scares so many people, right? The reason why I think so many bills have been introduced, right, is that when you're moving away from this is how I see the world and it has to be this way, that's when people get the most terrified, right?
Absolutely. When you challenge the standing powers.
That's right. That's what it is.
But the grandmother who you mentioned, and seeing it with, who want to learn, myself as well, and my friends, I mean, you want to learn how to use the pronouns correctly. You want to understand what they mean, and what it means when you don't use them correctly. And beyond that, right? That's
Right.
symbol and language, but what more to be an ally, as you say. In the trenches, as we think about wrapping up here, Kim,
Yep.
what kind of things besides the symbols, but coming back to the work you're doing at Ganesh Space and the mindfulness coaching that you do, and that you write so beautifully about, what are some things that you could leave listeners and viewers with that, really can help, whether they're in their own queer journey or like myself, trying to understand how to be a better ally?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think I'll answer if someone is in their own queer journey first, and the fact that I would just make sure that you have people affirming you, right? That's essentially what our space is when it comes down to, right? And so if you're not getting that affirmation from your family or people at school or people at work, then like find your community. You can always come to Ganesh Space if you need additional support, because I think when you're trying to figure out whether or not you feel crazy because of who you might love or how you identify, I think it's really important to see that it's totally normal, whatever that term means, right? And totally still perfect, right? And then I think in terms of allyship, I would say, one, practice queerness and being open, right? Being open to everything and being curious about everything, right? And I think something, another teacher who is sort of leading the sort of trans yoga space, very simply, he was just like, please just put your pronouns everywhere. I know it's just so simple, but like, and he was just like, and like, you see Instagram just like release that new sort of feature that you can do that. But I think it's a really big nod, because otherwise there's sort of like this dance that you have to do in certain spaces of like people not knowing how to appropriately identify someone, and then people get misgendered as a result, right? And so I would say, find some trans, particularly Black trans communities and organizations you want to donate to, put your pronouns in, and then just be open and open to learning, and knowing that you're probably going to make a mistake, and that's okay. But like, don't don't like let that limit you into wanting to continue to show up and be compassionate and human to all these different folks within the community.
I love that. Well, Kim, we have to wrap. I feel like there's so much more, I mean, to touch on, and the history books are being written as we speak. There has certainly been progress in the last 50 years, and even in the last 5 and 10. But we got a long, long way to go. And thank you for the work you're doing. And thanks for being a guest on Future of XYZ, talking about the future of queerness on this Thursday before Pride Parade.
Woohoo! Well, thank you so much, Lisa, and I appreciate your allyship and giving me a platform. And I hope everyone has a happy Pride.
Absolutely. And for everyone listening, find those places you can donate. Go out on the streets on Sunday and celebrate Pride and all of your queer brethren. And make sure, if you don't already, subscribe to Future of XYZ. You can find us on YouTube, you can find us on Instagram, and you can find us across streaming platforms wherever you get your podcasts. So thank you for listening. Thank you, Kim, and we will see you next week.